The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It beat against the tall windows of Belrose House with a steady force, as if the sky itself had come to collect a debt. Margaret Belrose stood in the doorway of her father's study, watching him work by candlelight though it was still afternoon. The storm had turned the day dark and gray, and the house smelled of damp wood and quiet fear. Silas Belrose sat hunched over his desk, his thin hair glowing softly in the candle's light. His quill moved with careful purpose across a thick, leather-bound ledger. Margaret knew that book well. It held the record of the Belrose family. Births, marriages, deaths. Everything that mattered to her father was written inside those pages. She had known what this moment would bring ever since the black carriage arrived weeks ago. Ever since her parents stopped speaking to her at dinner. Ever since the doctor shook his head and avoided her eyes, Silas dipped his quill again, tapped it once, then drew a single dark line through her name. Margaret Abigail Belrose. The line was straight and clean. Practiced. Her father did not look up. "You're hovering, Margaret. It's improper." She stepped fully into the room. "Nothing I do can be more improper than what you're doing now." Her voice surprised her. Flat. Empty. She had no anger left to spend. Silas finally looked at her. His pale blue eyes were cold and distant, like frozen water. "Your mother has packed what she believes is suitable. You should be grateful. We found someone willing to take you. Take you." Margaret folded her hands so tightly her fingers turned white. An interesting choice of words. I believe the proper term is purchase. His mouth tightened, but he reached into his desk and pulled out a leather pouch. Gold coins clinked softly inside. "The Duke of Crestmont is a man of great wealth and name," Silas said. "You will be his wife. A duchess. Many women would envy your position." "How much?" Margaret asked. Silas stiffened. "That is not your concern. How much am I worth?" she pressed. "A daughter who cannot bear children. A defective one. Surely you negotiated well." He stood suddenly, his chair scraping the floor. "You will not speak to me this way. Everything I have done has been for this family." "For Beatrice," Margaret said softly. "For her future. For your debts." The slap came without warning. Her head snapped to the side. She tasted blood, but she did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears only pleased them. "You will behave when the Duke arrives," Silas said. "You will be grateful." Through the rain-streaked window behind him, Margaret saw the black carriage rolling up the long drive. 4 dark horses pulled it, their hooves steady and sure. "He's here," she said. The chapel was cold despite the summer air. Stone floors chilled Margaret's feet through the thin soles of her shoes. She stood at the altar, wearing her grandmother's wedding dress, altered poorly to fit her frame. The ivory fabric had yellowed with age. The lace scratched her skin. She felt like an item pulled from storage and sold quickly before anyone noticed the damage. The Duke stood beside her. She had barely seen him before now. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothes that made him seem carved from shadow. His face was sharp and still, handsome in a distant, dangerous way. He did not look at her. The minister spoke quickly, his voice dull and rushed. "I do," the Duke said when prompted. 2 simple words. Final. When it was Margaret's turn, her father spoke from the pew. "She does." "I do," Margaret said herself, clear and steady. For the first time, the Duke looked at her. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds. Something unreadable passed through them, then was gone. He slid a plain gold ring onto her finger. It was too large. "I pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said. The Duke turned and walked away without waiting, without a glance back. Outside, the rain had stopped. The carriage door stood open. Margaret hesitated. "My things," she said quietly. "Will they be brought?" "There is no trunk," the Duke replied. His voice was calm, not cruel. "Your parents did not include one." The truth struck harder than the slap. She climbed into the carriage. The journey took hours. The Duke spoke once to tell her there was water under the seat. Margaret watched the land change as they traveled north. Fields grew rougher, trees thicker, the roads narrow. Crestmont Abbey rose from the hills at dusk, built of gray stone, vast and silent. It did not look welcoming. It looked watchful. An older woman in black greeted them. Her eyes softened when she looked at Margaret. "Your rooms are this way," she said. The suite was large, warm, and already prepared. A fire burned. Flowers rested on the mantel. Clothes filled the wardrobe, made to fit her. Dinner was silent. They sat far apart at a long table. Afterward, the Duke led her to a library filled with books and shadows. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid and handed her one. "You are wondering why I chose you," he said. "Yes. Your father made it very clear you could not have children. He thought this would lower your value." Margaret swallowed. "It did not." "No," the Duke said. "It made you perfect," he explained then. About his family, about the deaths, about inheritance and murder and blood, about why an heir would be a danger. "I needed a wife who would not give me a child," he said. "Your infertility protects me." Margaret felt hollow, useful, but still purchased. "I will not mistreat you," he continued. "You will have freedom here, respect. In return, you stand with me. No children, no betrayal." She thought of her name crossed out, of the rain, of being unwanted. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." The Duke nodded once. "Welcome to Crestmont Abbey." She slept alone that night, in a bed too large, in a house too quiet. But for the first time in years, no one had told her she was worthless. Margaret woke to a silence so deep it startled her. At Belrose House, mornings were filled with hurried footsteps, sharp voices, and doors closing too hard. Here, Crestmont Abbey breathed slowly, as if the walls themselves were asleep. She dressed herself in one of the gowns prepared for her, a deep blue dress that fit perfectly. The woman in the mirror looked unfamiliar, straighter, quieter, older somehow. A duchess, at least on the surface. Mrs. Hittrix, the housekeeper, appeared as if summoned by thought alone. "His Grace left before dawn," she said. "He will return in 3 days. You are free to explore." Free. The word felt strange. Margaret spent the morning walking the long halls, past covered furniture and faded portraits. Faces stared down at her, proud men and severe women who seemed to judge her for breathing their air. In one gallery, she noticed an empty frame. The wallpaper behind it was darker, marked by absence. The Duke's uncle, Mrs. Hittrix, said softly, "His portrait was burned after the trial." Margaret understood then that this house was not only lonely, it was wounded. On the second day, she found the estate office. The room was chaos. Papers everywhere. Ledgers stacked carelessly. Letters unopened. Bills ignored. Margaret felt something stir inside her, something she had buried long ago. Purpose. She closed the door behind her and began to work. She sorted papers into neat piles. She read invoices closely. She noticed numbers that did not add up. By nightfall, her fingers were ink-stained and her shoulders ached, but the chaos had begun to take shape. By the time the Duke returned, Margaret had uncovered theft, waste, and neglect across his lands. He found her in the library, holding a stack of ledgers. "Your steward in Yorkshire is stealing from you," she said before he could speak. "Your solicitor is inventing fees, and someone has been paying a chemist known for poisons." The Duke stared at her. "I can help," Margaret said, "if you let me." He laughed once, sharp and surprised. "My father said you were useless with figures." "Then your father was wrong," she replied calmly. From that moment, something shifted. They worked separately, but together. Margaret managed accounts. The Duke handled threats. They spoke often, Not as husband and wife, but as partners. Then the letter came. Margaret recognized her mother's handwriting instantly. The words inside promised hope. A doctor, a cure, a chance to restore her fertility. Her hands shook as she read. "What if it's true?" she whispered to Mrs. Herriques. "What would your mother gain?" the housekeeper asked, gently. When the Duke read the letter, his expression hardened. "If the doctor is real, he comes here. You do not go back," Margaret agreed. Days later, she noticed something wrong in the ledgers. Small changes. Minor entries altered. Someone was watching her work. That night, she waited in the dark. A maid entered the office quietly, carrying a lantern. Margaret closed the door behind her. The girl broke quickly. "My father hired you," Margaret said flatly when the truth spilled out. "Yes," the maid sobbed. "He wanted to know everything." When the Duke arrived, his fury was cold and precise. "We will feed him lies," he said, "and see what he does." Letters were sent, false ones, reports of tension, of doubt, of cracks in the marriage. 3 weeks later, the trap snapped shut. Margaret's father filed a public petition claiming she was imprisoned, mistreated, and denied medical care. The story spread fast. Visitors arrived, journalists, a magistrate. Margaret stood before them, calm and steady. "My father sold me," she said clearly. "Now he wants me back because I have value he failed to see." She showed contracts, evidence. Medical reports exposing the doctor as a fraud. The visitors left unsettled and silent. The next morning, the papers told a different story. Margaret was no victim. She was formidable. The Duke watched her from across the breakfast table. "He will not stop," he said. "No," Margaret replied, "but neither will I." And for the first time in her life, she meant it. The carriage that carried Margaret back to Belrose House was black and polished, bearing the silver crest of Crestmont on its door. It stopped before the familiar gates with a final crunch of gravel. Margaret stepped down without waiting for help. The house looked smaller than she remembered, shabbier. The illusion of importance had cracked. Her mother appeared in the doorway, hands trembling, eyes bright with forced relief. "Margaret, thank heaven. You've come to your senses." Margaret walked past her without answering. Her father was in his study, seated behind the same desk where her name had once been crossed out. He looked up, startled, then smiled thinly. "You've come home." "No," Margaret said. "I've come to end this." The Duke followed her inside and closed the door. Silas Belrose stiffened. "This is a family matter. It stopped being that when you sold your daughter," the Duke replied coolly. Margaret placed a leather folder on the desk and opened it slowly. "You hired a spy in my household. You shared private information with my husband's enemies. You filed a false petition accusing him of crimes he did not commit." Her father scoffed. "You cannot prove." She slid the first document forward. Bank records, signed letters, payments to the maid, correspondence with the false doctor. Silas's face drained of color. "You told the world I was imprisoned," Margaret continued. "But you were the one who trapped me. You decided my life was over at 12 years old." Her mother began to cry softly. "We did what we had to." "You did what benefited you," Margaret said. "And when you realized I was no longer worthless, you tried to reclaim me." Silas leaned back, defeated. "You would ruin your own family?" "You ruined it," Margaret said quietly. "I am simply refusing to carry the blame." The Duke stepped forward. "You will withdraw your petition publicly. You will confess to fraud and conspiracy. In return, we will not prosecute." Silas stared at the papers, his hand shaking as he reached for the pen. Pride battled fear. Fear won. When the confession was signed, Margaret opened the old family ledger. She tore out the page with her crossed-out name and folded it carefully. "I am no longer part of this record," she said, "and you are no longer part of my life." They left without looking back. Months passed. Cressmont Abbey changed, almost every annual compared to May. The account stabilized. The tenants prospered. The house grew warmer, fuller. Margaret moved through its halls with quiet authority, respected and heard. She and the Duke never pretended to be something they were not. Their bond was built on trust, not illusion. On choice, not obligation. Then the letters arrived. Charities asking if the childless Duke and Duchess might consider helping orphaned children. Margaret read them thoughtfully. One afternoon, she stood in the restored conservatory, sunlight warming the glass above her. "What if," she said slowly, "we created something different? Not heirs, not replacements, just refuge." The Duke studied her, then nodded. A home for those discarded. Children arrived weeks later. Quiet ones. Angry ones. Clever ones. Broken ones. Margaret saw herself in them. She taught them numbers, stories, how to stand straight and speak without apology. The Duke taught them discipline, honesty, and how to survive a world that rarely played fair. Laughter returned to Cressmont Abbey. One evening, Margaret stood on the balcony watching the children run through the gardens. "I was never barren," she said softly, "just told I was." The Duke stood beside her. "And even if you were, look what you've grown." Margaret smiled. Her parents had sold her believing her life was finished. They were wrong. She had not been chosen because she was broken. She had been chosen because she was strong. And in the end, that changed everything.